Yo, what's going on everyone? Welcome back. So, let's not lie, there are many unique trinkets in the world of Inuyasha, but amongst these trinkets are two specific assets that some of us may have questioned. In this video, we'll be going back in time to look at two interesting or otherwise historical pieces from this universe, the Tenseiga and the Bakusaiga. We'll be breaking down and going in depth looking into the Tenseiga's and Bakusaiga's history as well as revealing their capabilities. Truthfully, I'd say this video is more or less for those who may be confused about both swords' powers, or for those who have been longtime fans or supporters of the series. And maybe if you've never seen the series or watched very little of it, then hey, stick around as I'm sure you may be inspired to pick the series back up again or even begin watching it. Without further ado, let's see what both swords entail and unveil their true powers, techniques, and capabilities. Let's get started. Like most things, there lies an origin, or history, and the Tenseiga is no exception to that. The birth of Tenseiga began with both Totosai, who in short was simply an elderly yokai swordsmith who forged both Tenseiga and Tenseiga from the fangs of an old comrade, and Toga, who used his fangs so that both Tenseiga and Tenseiga could be made. By the way, for those listening, not this Toga, not this one. Toga was also said to be the most powerful demon and otherwise known as the father of both Sesshomaru and Inuyasha. The Tenseiga was originally wielded by Toga, but was created to withdraw the Meito Zengetsuha from the Tenseiga. This was done so that he'd be in possession of both swords, so that later he could pass them both down to his sons, one for each. After the death of their father, Sesshomaru was left with an heirloom, the Tenseiga. The Tenseiga possessed abilities to kill beings who were of or native to the netherworld, and because it could do this, both guardians which guarded the gate separating the world of the living from the world of the dead would not attack anyone wielding Tenseiga, thus permitting them to pass through the gate unharmed. The Tenseiga was set to resurrect 100 people with one swing, which was the reverse of the Tenseiga's capabilities, which possessed abilities to slay 100 demons with one swing. And as overpowered as the Tenseiga may sound, even it had its limitations in what it could do. For instance, in order to fully revive someone who died, their head and body must be intact. Reviving a decapitated head would in fact restore it to life, although it'd be incapable of functioning as it properly would, being if it had its body as well. Sesshomaru initially never wished to possess the Tenseiga, and regarded it as useless since it could never be used as a weapon outside of the netherworld. He journeyed in search for the Tenseiga's opposite, the legendary Tenseiga. Later, Sesshomaru found misfortune, learning that the Tenseiga was left to his younger brother, Inuyasha. The Tenseiga also had a barrier preventing Sesshomaru from wielding it. This forced him to venture for an alternative weapon, to which later he acquired Tokijin. In addition, Sesshomaru despised all humans, which by him harboring this vision prevented him from being able to use the Tenseiga. It was never until when sorrow and compassion were both learned, and felt, that he'd eventually learned of the sword's true properties. He never fully understood the behaviors of the sword, but always kept it by his side and refused to discard it, for there always seemed to be a benefit that was unforeseen. As most of us may know, or at the very least as some of us might have seen, Sesshomaru harbors a strong disdain towards humans and cares very little if not at all about others in general. His father was aware of this arrogance which permeated off of him. There was a high sense of an egotistic, pretentious attitude of his first son, and it was because of this behavior that Toga refused to pass down the Tenseiga to his older son. Since Tenseiga could never be used by someone who lacked little to no compassion, Toga hoped that bestowing Sesshomaru with it would eventually teach him compassion so that later he could use the sword. It was suspected that their father left Tenseiga to Sesshomaru for reasons never entirely explained, at least into the latter half of the series. According to Totosai, Sesshomaru was given the Tenseiga because it could protect him from the Tenseiga, just as Tenseiga could never hurt Inuyasha. Both swords share an interesting yet unique dichotomy amongst themselves, just as Inuyasha's and Sesshomaru's values and ideologies would clash. Both swords were specifically chosen, then divided amongst the two in order to teach them to get along with one another. And like both Sesshomaru's and Inuyasha's fathers, Sesshomaru's mother was also a compassionate yokai. His mother was shown to have a good heart, and lectured him for seeking to perfect the Tenseiga as a weapon of destruction rather than the weapon of healing. His mother would scold him about the qualities of the wielder of the Tenseiga, and highlighted the need for love, compassion, and a pure heart. She was shown to be quite authoritative, and was never afraid to give lectures if she thought he was acting too prideful without regarding the respect for life itself. And despite her methods of teaching, she truly did love her son, and would never place him in harm's way as she wanted what was best for him. As for powers and capabilities, Tenseiga possesses powers of restoring the life of the recently deceased by killing pallbearers who take the souls of the dead. However, as mentioned earlier, the requirement was that a relatively intact carcass would be needed for resurrection. An example would be when Rin died the first time. We see that after being mauled by wolves and mentioned to have bite marks, her body was still rather salvageable. Another limitation of the Tenseiga was that it could never bring people back from the dead more than once, as not to grant eternal life. As also mentioned earlier, if used on a decapitated body part, the part would be restored to how it once was when alive, but at some point would die again. The Tenseiga allowed for a loving and compassionate wielder to both see and slay beings from the underworld, as well as being capable of resurrecting 100 beings in one swing. It should also be mentioned that back when Toga was alive, he used the Tenseiga's resurrection capabilities to save the life of Izuyoi, otherwise known as the mother of Inuyasha. Another ability Tenseiga possessed was purification. This was shown after Ren's second death. Sesshomaru is seen showing compassion to the dead souls in the underworld. Shortly after, the Tenseiga was used to purify them of all their sins. The third ability was a protective barrier, also set to prevent Inuyasha from hurting Sesshomaru. Tenseiga could summon this barrier around the master of it since their life was in danger. It would then transport him across great distances to safety. Fourth was that the Tenseiga granted its wielder access to the netherworld through the border of the afterlife. This was seen after Guardians Gozu and Mezu allowed entrance after Sesshomaru drew the Tenseiga. And lastly, the Medo Zangetsuha. Sesshomaru's anger and sorrow because of Kagura's death allowed him the right to wield Tenseiga as a weapon after Totosai's arrival. Shortly after, the Tenseiga was reforged, and its offensive ability, the Medo Zangetsuha, was unlocked. Although, to strengthen the Medo, his mother and father would set a method that would teach him the meaning of losing someone dear to him, and to have a compassionate heart. After Ren's second death while inside of the netherworld, we saw this side of him, which, by him having felt this emotion for Ren, made the Medo mature considerably. The powers of the Medo technique created a path that sent anyone hit with it directly to the netherworld. Originally, the Medo would manifest as a complete massive black circle, which then sent an enemy's entire body and soul to the nether. However, when acquiring the technique for the first time, Sesshomaru could only cast the Medo in the form of crests, which would only send parts of a being to the nether along with their soul. Later, the Medo would grow into the form of an ellipse, but only after having felt compassion for Ren dying due to his mother's doing, as humans cannot survive the netherworld. As compassion continued to grow, the Medo Zangetsuha would continue to strengthen, until it became a perfect circle. As for the Bakusaiga, there's not much history on this aside from Totosai having initial foresight, implying that the sword was inside of Sesshomaru all along. The Bakusaiga was revealed during a confrontation with Magatsui. At one point during their battle, Magatsui engulfs a badly injured Sesshomaru with his body parts. Moments later, a blinding light emerges from within, and Bakusaiga is born, never as a passed down heirloom or crafted sword, but rather manifested from his own body of his own demonic power. It made Bakusaiga truly his own. It should be noted that the Bakusaiga was manifested from his left arm, to which some may remember was severed by Inuyasha in the earlier stages of the series. So basically he was left with no arm for the entirety of the series up until this sword was born. Sesshomaru's self-growth and abandoning his interest in stealing the Tenseiga as a quick path to power resulted in the birth of his own inner strength, which in the end eclipsed even that of his own father and the two heirloom swords that were derived from him. It was also noted that Sesshomaru had the potential to extinguish the lives of both Inuyasha and Naraku, but chose not to do so, and by an act of both maturity and self-growth, he understood that he could never use a power so recklessly. As for the Bakusaiga's capabilities, we see that it's able to decompose pretty much any organic material the sword blade cuts, and when cut, the target becomes infected, which destroys or disintegrates the body, which also eliminates any regenerative properties the target may have had. Alright, so for those of you who play Overwatch, imagine this. Basically a Genji blade with a Widow Mine attached to it. Just the sound of that, that's kinda busted. That's what we're getting at right now. An additive to this was that destruction which remained would continue spreading to any organic matter that came into contact with the original target, quite similar to a virus. Because of this primary property of the Bakusaiga, it was proven to be the demise to Naraku, as it prevented him from absorbing any parts of himself which were cut by the sword. There was no way he could reabsorb without inevitable risk of destroying himself. And the last technique of Bakusaiga was shown very briefly during a confrontation with Byakuya. While not having an exact name for this technique, it's shown that with Bakusaiga, Sesshomaru was capable of firing off a wave of explosive green blasts. This same blast is shown destroying thousands of demons in 1 second with a single swing. It was implied that this technique was easily more than 10 times more powerful than the Wind Scar. Alrighty, with that said, that pretty much wraps up everything you need to know about Tenseiga and Bakusaiga. As a final note, I want to add that Sesshomaru's father knew that he was capable of letting go and surpassing the Tenseiga, but his father only knew that he could achieve this by letting go of his grudge against his will, leaving the Tenseiga to Inuyasha, and the Tenseiga, otherwise known as the sword that will not cut, to Sesshomaru. That said, tell me your thoughts, and let's say if you were or weren't placed in Sesshomaru's situation, could you see yourself possessing such a sword? I leave that question to you. Alright, wait, just one more thing before I go. Can we all agree that Sesshomaru's fur looks comfortable? I mean, come on now, like, even Jockin has the right idea here. Alright, I'm done.